The Soviet Jewry movement and what we did was one of the most gratifying things I've ever done. We we were able to change the world. We were able to let my people go, as we always say. We were able to get the Jews of the Soviet Union out. And it wasn't so much what I did, and it wasn't so much what somebody else did, it's what everybody did.
Following World War II, the emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union was severely restricted. American Jews, including those living in Minneapolis and St. Paul, reacted by establishing a grassroots movement to pressure the conservative Jewish American leadership and the United States government to help the Soviet Jews. This resulted in a revolution in foreign policy, formally placing human rights at the forefront of foreign policy for the first time in modern history. The Soviet emigration issue provided the moral basis for the United States government to put pressure on the Soviet Union, resulting in reform of the Soviet emigration policies, allowing for the mass exodus of Jews, and ultimately contributing to the end of the Cold War. Jewish immigration to Israel was encouraged following its creation in 1948. Zionist yearnings of Soviet Jews to return to Israel were obstructed by the Soviet government, yet they were not allowed to practice their religion freely, resulting in a spiritual holocaust. The vast majority of Jews who attempted to emigrate were refused and came to be known as refuseniks. Israel's success in the Six-Day War in 1967 led to increased Zionist zeal worldwide. In the Soviet Union, an increasing number of refuseniks were denied emigration, as the KGB cracked down on their more inspired organized efforts. By 1970, refusenik frustration had grown to the point that several refuseniks attempted to hijack a plane in order to draw attention to their circumstances. Their thwarted effort led to a series of show trials and severe punishment. Meanwhile, American Jews felt a gnawing sense that they had not been sufficiently outspoken about the plight of Europe's Jews during the Holocaust, prior to and during World War II.
Learned of the Holocaust when I was about 12 or 13. No one ever talked about it then. And it became a very important piece in my growth as a human being. It was something I couldn't understand. It was something that was very emotional for me. One doesn't have to be a moron not to know that when history presents itself, you've got to answer, because nobody did the time before.
With news of the show trials reaching the United States, a grassroots movement of diverse Jewish organizations developed. In Minneapolis, the Minnesota Action Committee for Soviet Jewry formally organized in reaction to the trials.
The reason that the Soviet Jewry Committee existed was only twofold. It was, one, to get as many Jews out of the Soviet Union as we could, because their lives were endangered. And one, short of that, if we couldn't get them out, the idea was to make enough political noise in the West so that they would in some way be protected.
The more conservative National Conference on Soviet Jewry responded to the grassroots movement pressure by using their financial and political connections to influence the political process. At the national level, President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger were pressing the Cold War policy of détente, intended to limit and reduce the presence of missiles in Europe and the Soviet Union. Senator Henry Jackson, long a supporter of the Zionist movement, was well aware of the grassroots movement and tied the Cold War with the dilemma of the refuseniks. Jackson proposed an amendment to a trade bill that linked the provision of most favored nation status, an important trade concession, with human rights in reference to the Soviet Jews' plight. Despite Nixon and Kissinger's fear that this chastisement of the USSR might derail their policy of détente, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was passed in 1974. It linked foreign policy to human rights, signifying a revolution in diplomacy. Never before had human rights been a formal consideration in our relationships with other nations. In an effort to improve their image on the issue of human rights, the Soviets agreed to Basket 3 of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. The act stated that separated families should be allowed to reunite. The Carter administration seized this opportunity, immediately responding to Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov's letter, which cited the Soviet signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and encouraging continued U.S. pressure on the Soviets. However, it became impossible to balance détente while pressuring the USSR on human rights. Despite this focus on human rights, as opposed to the singular issue of Jewish emigration, the grassroots Soviet Jewry movement continued to grow. The Soviet Jewry Committee continued to pressure political leaders and to make noise to keep the issue in the public eye.
Gromyko was coming to St. Paul. He was the foreign minister, and they organized a candlelight vigil, and they got thousands of people there to the point, and we lined the streets of St. Paul, and it got to the point where he didn't show up.
In addition, they provided support to Jews living in the Soviet Union. They traveled there frequently, clandestinely smuggling religious artifacts and basic necessities, often in short supply. They developed the Adopt a Family program, the twinning or bar mitzvah sharing, and a letter-writing initiative remembering Jewish holidays and birthdays of Jews trapped in the Soviet Union.
We did the Adopt a Family program, we did the twinning program, did a lot of PR that originated here, the Prisoner of Conscience birthday stuff, and we did a lot of stuff that started here as grassroots and then shared and grew with the rest of the country.
When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, there was a major transformation in foreign policy. No longer was Soviet communism an entity on even terms with democracy in America. Reagan portrayed the USSR as an evil empire. Détente was dead. Communism became a moral issue to Americans. The problem of Jewish emigration was central to this morality. Reagan continuously pressured the Soviets and Gorbachev to open their borders for all who chose to emigrate. The grassroots movements throughout the United States continued to pressure Congress. Concerts, rallies, and other forms of protest were utilized to increase visibility and mobilize public opinion on the issue of Soviet Jewish emigration. A massive 1987 rally prior to a Reagan-Gorbachev summit in Washington demonstrated an unprecedented display of solidarity for Soviet Jewry, demanding that Gorbachev extend his policy of glasnost to Soviet Jews. Freedom Sunday, as it came to be called, was attended by 250,000 people.
There was just a buzz, a tangible buzz of energy and enthusiasm and passion, and of all these people gathered, for this common cause.
This included a considerable Minnesota contingent.
When we flew out to Washington when Gorbachev was here, the seats were on a plane were filled in, very quickly.
Within months of the rally, Gorbachev finally reformed Soviet policies, opening their borders to the emigration of Soviet Jews. After years of struggle, largely due to the efforts of the American Jewish community, there was a mass exodus of Jews from the Soviet Union. More than 1 million Jews emigrated to Israel, and another 500,000 to the United States. It would be naive to say the Soviet emigration issue brought about the end of the Cold War, as serious economic problems and an expensive arms race with the US, as well as the constant internal pressure from dissidents, all threatened to bankrupt and break up the Soviet Empire. However, the Soviet Jewry movement provided the moral basis for the United States to pressure the Soviets, resulting in the end of the Cold War.
It gave the U.S. a foot up on the battle of the Cold War. It put us on a higher moral ground, and it showed the U.S. that we could hold the Soviet Union to what they were really bad at, was human rights.
The mass exodus of Soviet Jews represented a success for the grassroots movement of American Jews, whose reaction to the Soviet Jewry emigration dilemma put pressure on the Jewish leadership, resulting in a collective effort to free their Soviet brethren. This unified Jewish voice provoked the United States to establish a revolutionary foreign policy, which, for the first time in modern history, focused on human rights. This revolution in United States foreign policy led to reform in the Soviet Union, opening the gates for millions of Jews and contributing to the end of the Cold War. The grassroots Soviet Jewry movement resulted in a victory for Soviet Jews, but more significantly, a victory for human rights.